Yes, I do speak two other languages. My Korean is not that good. It's perfect in the restaurant, but on the street it's not that good. But my second language was Spanish, and I was starting to study Spanish. I started back in the summer between fifth and sixth grade. I had to transfer schools, and I was actually a year behind in the Spanish studies. So I had to learn Spanish very quickly. And if I had a time machine, I would have gone back to when I was a lot younger and started to learn. Because I think to learn a language, you really need to start at a young age. I'm not saying that they have to intensively study, but just learning basic phrases and grammar is very important for language development. The government's recent announcement to ban English education for nursery, kindergartner, first and second graders in elementary school has triggered controversy. The reasoning behind the ban is that programs for these young children should be more focused on childcare and non-academic extracurricular activities rather than studying. The announcement was met with strong opposition by many parents. They point out it's not equitable for the government to ban English programs in regular kindergartens while more expensive, so-called English-dedicated private kindergartens are allowed to continue with their programs. Parents are also concerned that the ban will eventually drive children out to private academies which charge more for a similar level of education. They say that the government's decision will eventually place a heavier financial burden on parents. Whether the government will stick with or take back the decision, the bigger question remains: when is the right time for our children to start studying English? Some believe the earlier the better, while others say no one has two first languages, and therefore children don't need to rush to learn another language. The ability to learn English as a second language can develop after a child has sufficiently understood his or her native language. This seems to be a kind of topic that the most renowned linguists can't easily agree upon, so the decision of when and how to start children's English education should be practically made by the parents depending on their own philosophy. That being said, how much should the government be involved in families deciding the beginning of English education? Children should not be put in stressful learning environments at a young age. They should be able to play and enjoy themselves. English education should not be forced upon children. They should be focused on other activities for development. So I mentioned English education should not be forced upon children. So if you're forcing upon something, that means you're really pushing it. You're making somebody do something. So if you want to send your child to an English institution and they don't want to go, you're forcing it upon them to go and to learn. So that's when we use forced upon. Parents love the cost and the teaching style of the current after-school English program. The current after-school English program is not stressful and has great value for money. So when we say value for money, it means whatever the cost is, it's worth that cost. So, for example, if you go to Starbucks, you might spend 5,000 won on a coffee. Is that coffee value for money? In my opinion, it's not. But if I buy Pax coffee, it's 2,000 won or 3,000 won. I think that's the value for the money. I think a cup of coffee should cost about $2 to $3, not $5. So that's what we say, value for money. So if the English education is 30,000 won a week and you get 3 hours of education, that is definitely value for money. Parents understand the importance of English education. If the ban is implemented, parents may choose private English education institutions. The option would be costlier. So I mentioned if the ban is implemented, usually we use implement when we are talking about rules, laws, or restrictions. So my company implemented a new policy that we have to start at 8:30. So that's implement. So if the ban is implemented. And also finally, I said the option would be costlier. So costlier is what we use if something's going to cost more. So if we go back to the coffee example, Starbucks is costlier than Pax Coffee. So we use costlier, not more costly, costlier. Many parents think English education is so important in this modern society. The ban may drive parents to spend more money on private education. So when we talk about modern society, we'll talk about society that is today, that's happening now, and even what I'll mention later is global society. And I also said the ban may drive parents to spend more money. So we use drive in the obvious sense to drive an automobile, but we also use drive as a way of explaining to kind of get someone to do an action. So for example, my wife drives me crazy. It's kind of a way of talking about a feeling. Or if you have a stressful job, that might drive you to drink alcohol. So we used to use drive in another sense besides the automobile. One's native tongue will always be more fluent than a second or third language. Early language education may not lead to fluency later in life. Everyone learns at a different pace. So I mentioned one's native tongue. Your native tongue is your first language. Sometimes we use tongue as another word for language. So we use native tongue. We also sometimes use your mother tongue, which means your first language. And then I also talked about everyone learns at a different pace. So a pace is a speed usually, but when we talk about pace and learning, some people learn at a very fast pace. Some people learn at a very slow pace. It means it takes them longer to learn. So that's how we use pace. Starting language education at an earlier age may not lead to better language skills when children grow older. Children should master their first language, then have the option to learn a second language. So I said master their first language. So if you think about master, it's usually a boss, but the verb to master is to learn something and gain great skill at it, almost to become an expert. So you can master a game, you could master golf, and you can also master a language. That means to become an expert at a subject or activity. It's possible for children to grow up bilingual. Children who know 2 or more languages will have more opportunities in this global society. So, as I mentioned before, we said modern society, but we also say global society. So, since in this society we are kind of all connected through globalism and communication, we would talk about global society as, we all kind of have to work together. So, that's what we mean by global society. Many other countries have early bilingual education. Knowing 2 languages will give people the upper hand when they have to start their careers. Banning affordable English education will put some at a disadvantage. When I said mention give people upper hand is it means advantage. It means you have a slight advantage over your opponent, the other team, or in a group of people. So what we're saying is, if you can speak another language, you will have an advantage when you travel to another country. Also, when we say put someone at a disadvantage, that's kind of the opposite. Putting someone at a disadvantage means they do not have the upper hand. They have something that's going against them. So put at a disadvantage. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening and subscribing. See you next week.